Hey, it's Todd, and I'm talking about skill challenges. So, what is a skill challenge? Skill challenges were a thing that was introduced, at least into the D&D universe, in 4th edition, and it was a way of basically running a non-combat encounter. And really, what it's doing at its core is taking sort of a combat-style mechanic and applying it to a non-combat situation. So, what would happen is, much like if you have an enemy, an adversary that has a certain amount of hit points, and then each character in the party would take turns thwacking at this thing or otherwise damaging it until it runs out of hit points, it dies, and the encounter ends. A skill challenge sort of takes that same thing but applies it to something else. So you would, for example, say the goal was to get across a dangerous stretch of land for whatever reason. Maybe it's a swamp and there's quicksand, right? So the referee, the dungeon master might say something like, okay, you're going to be going across this thing. It's treacherous. There's quicksand. There might be some other hazards. You're going to need 5 successes as a group to get through. And so really what he's saying is this encounter has essentially, 5 hit points, right? But instead of using weapons to damage it, instead you're going to be looking at your skills, making rolls against those skills, and then for each success, you take off 1. When you get to 0, you've gotten all the successes you need. In this example, 5, you succeed. So I was not a huge fan, actually, of the skill challenge when it came out with 4th edition. I know that I think Matt Colville has sort of repopularized it, and I think that in the sense that he used it, at least if I'm remembering correctly, an example he used, I think, is probably the best way to use a skill encounter, when essentially you have sort of one outcome that you're moving towards. If I'm remembering correctly, I think in his case, they had defeated a villain and they needed to now escape this castle as it was crumbling around them. And so he used a skill challenge to simulate that escape. And so he might say, okay, the castle is crumbling down all around you, and it, you have to race, and now you're going to need, X amount of successes to get out. And then, each character could look and see how they might be able to get a success, whether it's somebody using their, perception check to find some sort of, exit that they hadn't seen before, some sort of maybe a passageway or stairs that leads up to a level that's closer to the surface, or vice versa. If they were high, they'll need to get down. Maybe someone else might use their stonemasonry skills to do something else. And again, you're trying to riff off whatever skills you have, and you're moving through this castle. I did find at times, particularly maybe when I was a player in the games I played, that when the goal was sort of narrowed just because of the skill challenge, that I felt it was sort of constricting. So I think in the case of, say, you have to escape from this creature. And, I think we had one, okay, you have to escape and you're running across these rooftops. This is your skill challenge. In that case, right, there's more options besides just running on the rooftops. If a castle's crumbling around you, there's really one thing you need to do, which is get out of the castle. And either you have some way to shortcut that whole thing. Let's say you had a teleportation circle or something, that's fine, or dimension door, whatever you could use. But if you don't have some kind of spell or item that sort of negates the entire thing, is yes, your only goal is to get out, because if you don't get out, you're going to die. And you don't have any other choices. You're really a binary state, right? You're either in the castle when it implodes and then you die, or you escape from the castle and you're good. But if you're in an open environment, then saying, okay, we're going to have the skill challenge to run across these rooftops. Well, I look down on my sheet and I say, well, I'm not a good rooftop runner, but it's a whole city. There's blocks and blocks and blocks. There's all kinds of things. Like, why am I now confined to doing this because it's a skill challenge, And I think at the other hand, another thing is you may not have the skills to really contribute much. And so you can have to try to rack your brain to try to figure out, well, gee, my guy is proficient in history. How do I use history to jump across rooftops? I don't know. Maybe I can. Maybe I can't. I think maybe some people say, well, that's where you get creative. Other people might say, that maybe it's a little bit unfair, whatever. I mean, if you're a historian and you have to run, well, that's, sucks that you weren't an athletic, you were a historian, whatever. That's what happens. But at the same time, I think it can narrow your focus maybe unnecessarily, right? Because if you are in a big environment, like you're escaping from a monster and he's in the city, The rooftops aren't the only way to go. Why can't I climb down and run along the streets? Why can't I do something else? Why do I have to do that? Well, I have to do that because that's what the skill challenge says. So it kind of injects maybe a little bit of meta into that, where instead of trying to figure out sort of in the fiction, I'm in a city, I'm on a rooftop, it's chasing me, what do I do? You start thinking maybe more in terms of this meta thing is I have this kind of meta monster with hit points that I have to defeat using my skills. How do I do that? So am I coming up with ways to defeat the skill challenge, or am I coming up with ways for my character to escape the creature? Right? Because there might be more options out there, but I'm not exploring them because instead I'm wondering how I can beat this sort of, and it's maybe in a sense, arbitrary skill challenge. But from the standpoint of if you have this sort of fixed goal, if you're in a binary situation, skill challenge might be a good fit. I think one thing that a skill challenge does do is, much like combat, it makes sure that everybody has a turn. Because you can be in situations, if you have a rogue or you have a magic user, you have a ranger, if you're in the wilderness, that one character with their skills can dominate the entire proceedings. If you're traveling from A to B and you have, say, a ranger as another character who doesn't have those capabilities, there may be a fair amount of time where you're not engaged because the ranger's making all the rolls, the ranger's making all the micro decisions potentially, and you're just along for the ride. In a skill challenge, much like combat, again, you're going to have not necessarily a set initiative order, but you're going to go around the table, and so you're definitely going to have a chance to impact what's happening for good or for ill. Right? I'm assuming you could probably play a skill challenge where you skip somebody if you are a historian and you're trying to run away, and all your skills are knowledge based and they don't impact at all. Maybe in some situations you would be able to pass. Maybe you just have to take a straight, ability check. That's probably something that would be very, table dependent. I remember being in a couple of them where I had to really sort of finesse to come up with how a skill I had could impact it. I think we also played that you couldn't use the same skill more than once. So you're running across the rooftops. Okay, you do the first one, athletics, great. And the second one comes around and I can't do athletics again. I got acrobatics. Okay, that works. And the third time, if we had to, maybe it's a little bit more, dicey. I don't remember in the fourth edition, how the rule exactly was stated. That was just maybe how our table did it. And I think maybe the thing is with this kind of tool is that you can adapt it to your needs. I think the positive part of it, right, is that it does engage everybody. And I think you can do things with this mechanic so that, as much as possible, everybody has somewhat of a fair chance to contribute. Now, obviously, given that, situations are going to vary, there are going to be times where maybe certain characters don't have much to contribute. And as a, if you're the referee, as a dungeon master, you could try to figure out a way to do that, or you can hand wave it and just say, okay, well, you're going to have to be carried by your compatriots in this one, or some other way to sort of mitigate if there is a character and player who isn't particularly engaged by a skill challenge. Overall, I think it is something that, is a useful tool, even in 5th edition. I know that I've seen it on Reddit in different places where people have talked about it and said, oh, I love that. It wasn't something that with my experiences in 4th edition that I was really raring to go. To me, it was sort of one of those things that I felt like the mechanics were starting to creep in on me, where everything was being pushed into this sort of look at your sheet kind of mechanic. Because coming from playing a lot of old school games where you don't have many skills or any skills, it's really up to you to be in the situation and just let your creativity and let your thing just take over and try to think of the world in the fiction and what you would do. Whereas with the skill challenge, you really are looking at your sheet, right? It's challenging your skills, and the creativity as a player does not come from looking at the fiction. It's looking at how you can maybe take your skill and, yes, apply it, but not in a way that takes into account what's actually going on, right? If I'm trying to, escape from a creature, I'm looking at my skill sheet first, and then I'm looking at my skill, and then I'm looking at how I can apply it, as opposed to maybe the other way, which would be looking at the situation, trying to do something, and then the referee, the dungeon master, asking me, okay, I think that's an acrobatics check. Roll acrobatics. So you see, you're going from sort of the fiction to the meta in the one sense, whereas the mechanics of your sheet and your skills, and on the other hand, you're going from the skills first and then thinking about how to apply them in the situation. It's not a huge difference, but I think it is it is sort of a difference in how you approach these kind of things. And coming from sort of an OSR kind of old school background, I'm used to going from the former, just looking at the situation, trying something, and then being told, oh, hey, that's agility. Give me a roll, or not, or however the GM decides to adjudicate it, as opposed to figuring out what I want to adjudicate first and then fitting it in the box, right? I know history. How can I use that history and slot it in here to get this success that we need? So not a huge difference, but it is one, and maybe one to be aware of as far as what kind of game, you want to run. I think there's sort of another riff on the skill challenge, something that I think the One Ring, and it may be in other places, but definitely the One Ring and its 5th edition counterpart. I know they made some source books to kind of port that over to 5th edition, which was when you're traveling, you assign roles. So in this case, instead of having, let's say, different people bringing their skills to bear over, a certain challenge, in this case, you have sort of an ongoing challenge, right? Every day you're on the road, and people take on specific tasks that have specific requirements. So, one character will be the navigator. One character will be in charge of food. One character may be in charge of being a lookout. And so in a sense, you're assigning out, instead of saying, I'm going to pick from a sheet to fulfill this particular challenge. Here we have an ongoing challenge, and I'm going to pick a role. Maybe it's a role that's well suited to my skills. So in that case, they're kind of similar, right? In that sense, that I'm hopefully going to pick, if I'm a navigator or if I'm the lookout, maybe I pick because I have great perception, but you may not have a choice in some things. And then how you roll how you do in those roles by rolling the dice and checking, difficulty challenge numbers, ratings, and all that will determine how well that day of challenge goes, and if there are any difficulties and what those difficulties may be. So it's a little bit different, but it's in that same thing of that idea of how can we engage everybody in a particular activity. And, in this case, instead of you assigning skills, you get assigned a general role, which you then follow through. And it probably has some of the same pitfalls maybe as skill challenges do. I think on the one hand, it can be, depending on how you run it, of course, it can feel a little gamey in the sense that, why can't the navigator also be the lookout, or how many of these roles can one character take? Because if you have great perception and you're the ranger, can you be both the lookout and the navigator? And if you're taking on multiple roles and then another character takes on multiple roles, and again, you have that issue where maybe only 2 of your 3 or 4 or 5 party members, is engaged. And then similar to with the skill challenges, are you engaging with the fiction when you're playing, or are you engaging with the mechanics, which is you're just trying to engineer things to succeed at the mechanical part, and you're not engaged with just being your character in the world. And they're different, they're different approaches. There's not one is not right, one's not right, one's not wrong. It's a matter of, what your party likes, how you like to play. But again, it's a nice tool, because if you do find that you maybe have 1 or 2 players, and I know I've been that player at times, that can sort of dominate what's happening. If the other players don't speak up and they're not active, then the 1 or 2 players maybe take over, and start to kind of run the show and make all the decisions. When you're doing these kinds of things, whether it's a skill challenge, whether it's taking on these kind of roles, each player, each character is going to get highlighted. Their turn is going to come, and then, they're going to have to, or they're going to have the ability to contribute. And that's a positive thing. I think, where I maybe have issue with it is where I feel like it becomes a little bit too constrictive and a little bit too much about, how we're doing something mechanically versus how we're doing the fiction. But that said, I do think it is a powerful tool. And I think you can think about ways to take those things, for instance, the One Ring with the navigating the wilderness. There's no reason why you couldn't have a similar sort of standard operating procedure for dungeon crawling, right? Where one person is, checking for traps ahead. One person is looking out for trouble. Maybe another person is mapping, right? So you can sort of take that idea and sort of spread it around in sort of different areas. I think something that I've messed around with a little bit in my game is kind of having that similar structure for social encounters. So again, that you don't have one player or one character who loves to talk, just getting in front and doing all the talking and constantly being the party mouthpiece. Where you spread it around, make sure that each character gets a chance, to be in that spotlight, for good or for ill. And I think in all these cases, you're going to run into some people who don't want that. We think it's always a positive for everybody to be engaged all the time and everybody have their moment, but some characters, some players, they don't want that. I've heard from people that say, hey, that's not good for me. I'm sort of socially awkward. I don't like to talk. I don't like to do that. And, this video is not really about that. You can work with it, right? But the idea is that you have these tools, skill challenge, and then this kind of roles and role challenges, I guess maybe we call party challenges, maybe would be the thing to really engage everyone all the time. And I think that is a good thing. Even if I didn't necessarily always like how the mechanic worked, I could see that it had a positive idea, because I think the idea that everybody gets a turn is a good one, particularly in these kind of games, because it's easy for one person to take over. It's easy for someone to feel left out. But in this case, you're going to have your name called, your number called, much like in combat. Your turn's going to come and you'll have a chance to act. And it may not be positive. You could fail. That's fine. We can't, there's no trying if you're afraid to fail, but at least you got to use your moment, have that moment. If you had a particular idea or something you wanted to do, you're not going to get run over, spoken over by somebody else. You will have your turn, and that's a good thing. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video about skill challenges and their like. If you like these, please do subscribe. It helps me out a lot. I also have a Patreon I can link to if you'd like to support me in that way. But otherwise, I will talk to you later.